Donna Summer spent most of her career being loved by millions of strangers. In 1978, inside a Lowe's Angels recording booth, she found someone who loved her without an audience watching. The song was Heaven Knows, a duet built around her voice and a vocal group called Brooklyn Dreams, and the man singing opposite her, Bruce Sudano, was not a fan, not a producer, and not another star chasing proximity to her fame. He was simply a working musician who happened to be in the room that day, and neither of them, according to those who later spoke about it, seemed to expect that the session would change the direction of both their lives. It was, by most accounts, an entirely unremarkable afternoon of studio work, the kind of session that happens dozens of times in any given year, forgettable to almost everyone involved except, eventually, to the two people at its center. By 1978, Donna Summer was arguably the most commercially dominant woman in American music. Her name synonymous with disco itself at the exact moment the genre had become inescapable on radio, television, and dance floors across the country. Her schedule left little room for anything resembling an ordinary life. Constant touring, relentless studio sessions, label obligations, and a level of public visibility that made privacy almost structurally impossible. Interviews from the period describe a woman whose calendar was planned months in advance by people whose priority was her commercial output, not her personal well-being. Fame, at that scale, tends to isolate rather than connect, surrounding a person with attention while leaving little space for anyone to know them apart from the persona. Even the people closest to her professionally often related to her primarily through the demands of her career, rather than through anything resembling an ordinary friendship. According to those close to her at the time, Donna Summer rarely had the chance to interact with people who were not, in some way, already invested in her stardom. Collaborators arrived with professional agendas, admirers arrived with expectations, and even close friendships could feel shaped by her celebrity rather than separate from it. It was, by most descriptions, a life crowded with people yet frequently short on the kind of unguarded, unremarkable company most people take for granted. That backdrop makes the Heaven Knows session unusual. It placed her, however briefly, in a working relationship with someone whose presence had nothing to do with courting her fame and everything to do with the music itself. For an artist surrounded by people whose attention was almost always, in some way, transactional, that distinction reportedly stood out. Bruce Sudano was, at that point, a member of Brooklyn Dreams, a vocal group with its own modest but genuine following, and a songwriter in his own right rather than simply a performer standing in someone else's shadow. He had not built his career around Donna Summer, and he was not seeking one through her. Brooklyn Dreams had achieved its own modest chart success independently, meaning Bruce Sudano entered the collaboration as a peer with something to contribute, not as someone hoping proximity to a bigger star might elevate his own career. That distinction mattered. In an industry where proximity to a star often came loaded with ambition, Bruce Sudano's involvement in the session was, by most accounts, driven by the collaboration itself rather than by what closeness to her might offer him professionally. He arrived with his own creative identity already formed, which meant he had comparatively little need to define himself in relation to hers. The recording of Heaven Knows brought the two of them into repeated, sustained contact, not a single fleeting encounter, but the kind of extended studio collaboration that allows two people to observe each other honestly, away from the choreographed distance of a red carpet or a press appearance. In a studio setting, professional respect is typically earned through the work itself. Timing, tone, the small adjustments a collaborator makes without being asked, rather than through any performance of charm. According to accounts from people familiar with the period, it was during this working relationship, rather than any single dramatic introduction, that something beyond professional respect began to take shape between them. There was no singular, cinematic moment reported by either party, only the accumulation of small, ordinary interactions that gradually became something neither had necessarily planned for, the kind of shift that is often invisible until it has already happened. At some point during or shortly after that collaboration, Donna Summer faced a quieter version of the choice so many public figures eventually confront: whether to let a genuine connection develop with someone who had entered her life through work rather than fame, even though doing so meant exposing a private vulnerability to a world that expected her to remain, at all times, the confident, larger-than-life woman on stage. Public figures at her level rarely get the luxury of an uncertain relationship playing out away from scrutiny. Choosing to pursue that connection was not a guaranteed outcome. Plenty of similarly promising studio relationships fade once the recording session ends, and the participants return to separate, unequal orbits. Fame has a way of reasserting itself the moment the music stops, pulling public figures back into schedules that leave little room for anything unplanned. This one did not fade, despite every reasonable expectation that it might. Donna Summer and Bruce Sudano's relationship deepened steadily over the following 2 years, developing largely outside the glare that surrounded her professional life, and in 1980 the two were married. It was, by the standards of a career defined by spectacle, a remarkably unspectacular event in its emotional core, not a publicity moment engineered for headlines, but the culmination of a bond that had formed gradually, in recording booths and quiet moments between sessions, far from any stage. Those close to the couple have generally described the wedding itself as intimate rather than spectacular, consistent with how the relationship had developed in the first place. The marriage arrived at a complicated moment for Donna Summer professionally, as disco's commercial dominance had already begun to falter, and the genre she had come to symbolize faced a mounting cultural backlash. Yet even as her career entered a turbulent, uncertain stretch, her personal life was, by most accounts, gaining a stability that had been largely absent during the previous years of non-stop touring and label demands. It was an unusual inversion. While her professional world grew less predictable, her private world was, for perhaps the first time in years, becoming more settled. The couple would go on to raise a family together, including a daughter who would later pursue music herself, extending the relationship's influence well beyond the initial recording session that started it. That the union produced not just a family, but a second generation of musical involvement only reinforced, in hindsight, how much had grown out of one modest studio afternoon. What makes this story notable is not simply that two musicians fell in love. Collaborations turning into relationships are hardly rare in the entertainment industry, but that this particular relationship endured through exactly the kind of instability that so often ends them. Donna Summer's commercial fortunes rose and fell dramatically across the following decade, and the pressures of her religious conversion, her career reinventions, and disco's steep decline all placed real strain on her public and professional identity. Through each of those upheavals, the marriage itself was rarely, if ever, reported as being in similar turmoil, a notable exception in an industry where personal and professional instability so often arrive together. Biographers examining this period have noted how rare that kind of stability was among artists navigating a genre's sudden collapse. Biographers and those close to the couple have generally framed the relationship as evidence of something Donna Summer rarely got credit for during her most famous years: an ability to build something lasting and unglamorous at a moment when everything else in her life was engineered for spectacle. The contrast between the public Donna Summer, sequined, electrified, larger than any single room she performed in, and the private woman who built a decades-long marriage with a working musician she met by accident, says something meaningful about which version of her fame ultimately mattered most to her. It suggests, at minimum, that the persona audiences adored was never the whole of who she understood herself to be. Those who knew the couple personally have generally described their household as unusually grounded, more concerned with raising a family than with maintaining any particular public image. It would be easy, in retrospect, to treat the Heaven Knows session as simply a footnote in Donna Summer's much larger musical catalog, another duet among dozens of recordings from her most productive years. But for the two people who met in that booth, it was something closer to a beginning, one that outlasted disco itself, outlasted the industry's changing tastes, and outlasted nearly every headline written about her during the years that followed. Few of the executives, promoters, or journalists who shaped her public narrative in 1978 could have guessed that this particular session, among so many, would prove to be the one that mattered most in her personal life. It remains, even now, one of the least mythologized moments in her entire career. No headline, no scandal, just two musicians finishing a song together. Decades later, long after the singles charts had moved on and the mirror balls had gone dark, Donna Summer's marriage to Bruce Sudano remained one of the more quietly durable relationships to emerge from the disco era. A reminder that behind the version of her the world danced to, there was a woman who, however briefly and however privately, simply wanted to be loved by someone who had walked into her life without an audience already watching. That, more than any chart position or sold-out arena, may be the quieter legacy worth remembering, and one that, unlike so much of her public story, was never really about being watched at all. In an industry built almost entirely on visibility, the most enduring thing Donna Summer built may have been the one relationship she never had to perform for anyone.